She was up before everyone else, not because an alarm forced her, not because a notification pulled her phone from her nightstand at 6 in the morning and dragged her into other people's urgencies before she had found her own footing for the day. She was up because her body knew it was time, because her sleep had been complete, and her schedule was consistent, and her mornings had begun at the same hour for long enough that the hour had become internal rather than external, biological rather than mechanical. By the time the children arrived in the kitchen for breakfast, she had been awake for 30 to 40 minutes, dressed, had her first cup of coffee, and had already conducted the quiet mental survey of the day's requirements that allowed her to receive the morning's first demands from a position of readiness rather than reaction. She was not superhuman. She was not running on a different biological engine from the woman of today who arrives at the kitchen at 7:15, still half asleep, carrying the specific fog of someone who went to bed at midnight after 2 hours of screen time and who needs 20 minutes of coffee before she can fully function. She was running on a rhythm, a daily rhythm that was ancient in its underlying principles and specific in its 1950s application, a rhythm that aligned the demands of the household's daily schedule with the natural rhythms of human biology in a way that produced sustained energy across the day rather than the peaks and crashes and mid-afternoon collapse that the contemporary daily schedule so consistently produces. Here's the core of what this video is about, and you need to hear it in the first 5 minutes clearly. The energy of the 1950s housewife was not exceptional.
It was the natural output of a lifestyle that was, almost by accident, aligned with what human biology actually requires for sustained daily energy. Regular sleep and waking times. Physical activity distributed across the day rather than absent during the day and crammed into a gym session at 8 in the evening. Meals eaten at consistent times from real food that provided sustained fuel rather than the spike and crash pattern of the contemporary diet. Rest taken at its natural midpoint rather than deferred indefinitely. Social connection woven into the daily routine rather than separated from it as a scheduled activity that may or may not happen. These are not secrets. They are the findings of sleep science, circadian biology, nutrition research, and exercise physiology, documented and published in peer-reviewed research across the past 40 years, describing what human bodies need in order to function at their best. The 1950s housewife did not know the science. She simply lived in the rhythm that her household structure imposed on her. A life that happened to fulfill most of what the science would later describe as the requirements for sustained human energy. This video is about that rhythm, what it consisted of, why it worked, how the specific daily pattern of the 1950s housewife's life produced the energy that people who grew up around those women still remember, and about what replaced it, and why the replacement produces the specific exhaustion that has become the default condition of the contemporary adult's daily experience. Stay with us. Consider subscribing before we begin. What follows connects the everyday habits of the 1950s household to the biology that explains them, and the explanation is immediately applicable to the household you are managing today. The sleep that was actually sleep. The energy of the 1950s housewife began, as all sustained human energy must, with sleep.
Not sleep as a residual, the hours remaining after everything else had claimed its share of the day. Sleep as a structured, consistent, sufficient nightly event whose timing and duration were approximately the same every night of the week. The circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs the body's daily cycle of alertness and rest, is one of the most thoroughly studied systems in modern biology. The research on it, which has been accumulating since the Nobel Prize-winning work on circadian mechanisms was published in the 1980s and 1990s, establishes with remarkable consistency that the human body's optimal functioning depends on two sleep-related factors: duration, approximately 7 to 9 hours for most adults, and consistency, specifically the consistency of sleep and wake times across days of the week. Consistency is the less understood of the two requirements, and it is the one most thoroughly violated by the contemporary lifestyle.
The sleep schedule of the typical contemporary adult shifts by 1 to 3 hours between weekdays and weekends, a pattern that sleep researchers call social jet lag, because its biological effects are similar to those of regular transatlantic travel. The body's circadian clock is set by the consistent timing of light exposure and activity, and a sleep schedule that shifts by 2 hours every Friday and Saturday night desynchronizes the body's internal clock from its external schedule in a way that impairs cognitive function, metabolic regulation, and immune response throughout the week. The 1950s housewife's sleep schedule was not consistent because she was disciplined about sleep in the modern sense of tracking her sleep stages with a wearable device and optimizing her sleep hygiene. It was consistent because her daily schedule was consistent, because the demands of the household imposed a regular structure on her days, and because the cultural and social norms of the 1950s, including the general social norm that adults went to bed at a reasonable hour and that staying up past 11 o'clock on a weeknight was unusual rather than standard, supported a consistent sleep schedule without requiring deliberate effort to maintain it. The average American adult in 1950 went to bed at approximately 10 to 10:30 and rose at approximately 6 to 6:30, according to time use surveys conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the early 1950s. This schedule provided between 7 and 8 hours of sleep opportunity per night, aligned with the recommendations that sleep science would later establish for adult sleep duration. And it was consistent enough from night to night that the circadian system was stabilized rather than continuously disrupted. The average American adult today sleeps approximately 6 hours and 40 minutes on weeknights, according to National Sleep Foundation surveys, with significant variation between weeknights and weekends. The specific combination of shortened duration and inconsistent timing that characterizes contemporary American sleep is the combination that sleep science identifies as most damaging to the alertness and cognitive function that sustain daily energy. The 1950s housewife had energy in part because she was not chronically sleep-deprived in the way that the contemporary adult typically is. This is not a complicated finding. It is the most direct and most quantifiable of the explanations for the energy difference, and it is the explanation that requires the least change in lifestyle to act on. The physical activity that was never called exercise. The second explanation for the 1950s housewife's sustained daily energy is the one that is simultaneously the most obvious when stated and the most consistently overlooked in contemporary discussions of daily energy. She moved her body continuously throughout the day because the work of managing a household in 1950 was physical work. The physical demands of managing a 1950s household without the labor-saving devices that have since become standard were substantial and have been documented in time-use studies that measured the specific activities performed by American housewives in the early 1950s and the energy expenditure those activities required. The University of Michigan's time-use studies from the early 1950s found that housewives in non-farm households spent approximately 52 hours per week on household work, including cooking, cleaning, laundry, child care, and household management, with the physical demands of that work distributed across the waking hours of the day. Hand-washing clothes in a wringer washer required significant upper body effort, with the wringing process alone generating meaningful muscular work. Hanging laundry on the clothesline required repeated reaching and lifting. Scrubbing floors on hands and knees was a cardiovascular and muscular activity of meaningful intensity. Kneading bread dough was sustained upper body work. Sweeping and mopping floors moved the body through the specific patterns of low-intensity continuous activity that exercise physiologists now identify as particularly beneficial for metabolic health and sustained energy levels. None of this was called exercise. It was simply the physical dimension of the work that needed to be done. But its effects on the body were the effects of regular, moderate physical activity, maintained cardiovascular fitness, muscular endurance, a metabolic rate elevated above the baseline of sedentary activity, and the specific energy benefit that regular physical activity produces through its effects on the body's energy systems. The exercise physiology research of the past 3 decades has documented extensively that regular, moderate physical activity distributed across the day, what researchers call non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, has metabolic and energy effects that are distinct from and, in some respects, superior to the equivalent amount of energy expenditure concentrated in a single exercise session. A person who moves regularly throughout the day, whose daily activity level is consistently moderate, maintains a metabolic profile and an energy production capacity that a sedentary person who exercises intensely for 1 hour 3 times per week does not fully replicate. The 1950s housewife, whose daily activity level was maintained by the physical demands of her household work, was inadvertently practicing the distributed daily movement pattern that contemporary exercise science now actively promotes as optimal for sustained daily energy. She was not running marathons. She was not doing interval training. She was sweeping and mopping and hanging laundry and kneading bread and managing a household that required physical engagement throughout the day. And this continuous, moderate physical engagement was producing the sustained energy that observers remember. The contemporary housewife, or the contemporary dual-income household's domestic manager, does the same household work with significantly less physical effort because the appliances that have replaced manual labor have also replaced the physical activity that manual labor provided. The washing machine, the dishwasher, the vacuum cleaner, the food processor, each one is a labor-saving device in the literal sense that it saves labor.
and the labor it saves was physical activity that produced energy benefits its replacement does not provide.
The contemporary adult who has eliminated the physical demands of household work through appliances and then attempts to replace the lost physical activity through scheduled exercise sessions is performing a substitution that exercise science finds imperfect. The metabolic and energy benefits of distributed daily movement are not fully replicated by the same caloric expenditure concentrated in a single session, because the biological mechanisms they engage are distinct. The meals that fueled rather than spiked. The third explanation for the 1950s housewives' sustained daily energy is the one that nutrition science has been documenting most extensively in recent decades. She ate differently, and the food she ate produced a different pattern of blood glucose and energy availability than the food that replaced it. The 1950s American housewife typically ate 3 meals a day at consistent times, with minimal snacking between meals.
Breakfast was a cooked meal: eggs, toast, oatmeal, or some combination of protein and complex carbohydrate that provided sustained fuel. Lunch was a complete meal: soup and sandwich, or a hot lunch if the household's schedule permitted, or a substantial cold plate assembled from the previous evening's leftovers. Dinner was the main meal of the day, a protein with cooked vegetables and a starch, prepared from fresh or preserved ingredients rather than from processed packages. The nutritional profile of this meal pattern, assessed against the contemporary understanding of blood glucose regulation and its relationship to sustained energy, was favorable in several specific ways. The consistent meal timing that characterized the 1950s diet aligned with the circadian regulation of metabolism that contemporary chrononutrition research has documented.
The body's insulin sensitivity, its capacity to process glucose efficiently, follows a circadian pattern that peaks in the morning and declines through the day. Eating the largest meal at the time of highest insulin sensitivity and eating at consistent times that the circadian system can anticipate and prepare for produces more stable blood glucose and more consistent energy than eating at irregular times or eating the largest meal at night when insulin sensitivity is lowest. The protein content of the 1950s meals, which was substantial in a diet built around eggs at breakfast and meat at dinner, provided the amino acids that sustain energy through their role in neurotransmitter synthesis.
The specific proteins that produce dopamine and serotonin, the neurotransmitters most directly associated with motivation and sustained mood, are synthesized from dietary amino acids, and their production is limited by the availability of those amino acids, which in turn is limited by dietary protein intake. The complex carbohydrate content of the 1950s diet, which came primarily from whole grain bread, potatoes, root vegetables, and legumes, rather than from the refined sugars and processed starches that dominate the contemporary diet, produced a slower and more sustained blood glucose response than the refined carbohydrates it has been replaced by. The glycemic index research that began in the 1980s documented the specific relationship between carbohydrate source and blood glucose trajectory, establishing that the complex carbohydrates of the 1950s diet produced the gradual rise and gradual decline in blood glucose that sustained energy requires, while the refined carbohydrates of the contemporary diet produced the rapid spike and rapid crash that produces the mid-morning and mid-afternoon energy collapses that contemporary workers have learned to manage with coffee and sugar. The absence of frequent snacking was another energy-relevant feature of the 1950s meal pattern. The contemporary norm of eating every 2 to 3 hours, driven partly by the availability of portable processed food and partly by the misapplied nutritional advice of the 1990s that frequent small meals were metabolically superior to fewer, larger meals, produces the continuous, low-level insulin secretion that research has associated with insulin resistance and with the specific kind of metabolic dysfunction that presents as chronic fatigue and difficulty sustaining energy across the day. The 3-meal-a-day pattern, with genuine fasting periods between meals, which was simply how people ate in the 1950s because snack food was not ubiquitous and food was not available at every moment and in every location, aligned with the intermittent fasting patterns that contemporary metabolic research has found beneficial for insulin sensitivity and sustained energy. The rest that was actually resting. The fourth explanation for the 1950s housewife's energy is the one that sounds paradoxical until understood. She rested. She rested at the appropriate time in an appropriate way, without the guilt and the distraction and the competing claims on attention that make contemporary rest ineffective. The midday pause was a recognized and practiced feature of the 1950s daily rhythm in a significant proportion of American households. After the lunch dishes were done and before the afternoon's work resumed, many housewives sat for 15 to 30 minutes in genuine stillness. A cup of tea, a brief rest in a chair, the specific suspension of purposeful activity that the body requires for the consolidation of the morning's work and the recovery of the energy the morning had spent. The biology of the midday rest has been documented by sleep researchers, including Sarah Mednick at the University of California, Riverside, whose research on napping has established that a brief rest, even as short as 10 to 20 minutes, at the body's natural circadian low point in the early afternoon, produces measurable improvements in alertness, cognitive function, and mood for the hours that follow. The circadian dip in alertness that most people experience between 1 and 3 in the afternoon is not a lifestyle failure. It is a biological reality that the 1950s household's rhythm accommodated and that the contemporary workplace's schedules typically do not. The housewife who rested after lunch was doing something that her body needed and that produced a measurable benefit in the afternoon hours. The contemporary office worker who fights through the afternoon energy dip with caffeine is overriding a biological need in a way that compounds the day's accumulated fatigue without addressing it, producing the specific condition of the person who is tired all afternoon and then too wired from afternoon caffeine to fall asleep at an appropriate time in the evening, which begins the cycle of the next day's insufficient sleep. The rest that the 1950s housewife took was also cognitively different from the rest that a contemporary person attempting to rest typically experiences, because it was not interrupted by the notifications and the checking and the ambient anxiety of connectedness that characterize contemporary leisure time. A woman sitting in a chair in 1950 with her afternoon tea was in a state of genuine cognitive rest. There was nothing to check. There was no stream of information that she might be missing. The rest was rest. The actual suspension of mental engagement that allows the brain's consolidation processes to run. The contemporary concept of rest has been corrupted by the ubiquity of the smartphone, which has made genuine cognitive rest almost impossible for people who carry one. Research on smartphone use and cognitive fatigue, published in the Journal of the Association for Consumer Research in 2017, found that the mere presence of a smartphone in a person's visual field, even when turned face down and set to silent, reduced the available cognitive capacity of the people in the study compared to people who had left their phones in another room. The phone's presence was a cognitive drain even when it was not being used, because the habit of checking it had become strong enough that inhibiting the habit required cognitive resources. The 1950s housewife's afternoon rest was not interrupted by a phone she was not checking. It was simply rest. And the rest it provided was genuinely restorative in a way that the rest available to a contemporary person in the same 15 minutes, occupied by scrolling through a feed rather than sitting quietly, is not. The social connection that sustained rather than depleted. The fifth explanation for the 1950s housewife's energy is one that is less obvious, but equally well supported by the research on human well-being. Her social connection was woven into her daily routine, rather than being a separate activity that competed for already depleted time and energy. The coffee clatch with the neighbor on Tuesday morning was not a social event in the scheduled sense of a commitment that had to be planned and managed. It was the natural outcome of a social life organized around neighborhood proximity and daily routine, in which the people the housewife was connected to were also the people whose daily rhythms brought them into regular contact with her daily rhythm. The neighbor who came for coffee came because she lived next door, and the rhythm of their mornings brought them to the same point at the same hour on Tuesdays, without requiring either of them to schedule it. This distinction between social connection that is embedded in daily routine and social connection that requires scheduling and effort to maintain against the competing demands of a complex modern life is one that social psychology research has found to be significant for the quality of the social experience and for its effects on well-being. The research of John Cacioppo and William Patrick, published in their book Loneliness, Human Nature, and the Need for Social Connection, and the broader field of social neuroscience that their work helped establish, documents the effects of social connection on human physical health, cognitive function, and subjective well-being. The findings are consistent. People who are socially connected, who feel embedded in a network of relationships that provides both practical support and emotional belonging, show measurably better outcomes on virtually every health and well-being measure studied. They live longer, are physically healthier, are more cognitively resilient, and are more subjectively satisfied with their lives than socially isolated people. The specific form of social connection that the 1950s housewife experienced, embedded in the daily fabric of neighborhood life and household routine, was the form that social psychology finds most beneficial. The frequent, low-stakes, personally engaged contact with known others that the research distinguishes from the high-stakes, effortful, scheduled social engagements that contemporary adults more often experience. Frequent, low-stakes social contact. The wave across the fence. The neighbor who stopped to chat during the morning errand. The phone call with a sister in the afternoon, the informal gathering that happened because the neighborhood's social fabric supported it, produced the specific kind of social nourishment that the human social brain is designed to receive continuously rather than periodically. The contemporary adult who schedules a dinner with friends once a month, because that is what the competing demands of modern life allow, is receiving social nourishment in a single large dose at intervals that the social brain is not designed to receive it. The social brain, like the body's energy system, functions optimally when supplied regularly and consistently, rather than periodically and abundantly. The 1950s housewife's frequent, embedded social contact was a continuous supply of the social nourishment that maintained her social well-being, which was in turn part of the foundation of her sustained daily energy. Social connection is energizing when it is the right kind of connection in the right amount. Social isolation is depleting, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from social contact that is insufficient or low quality is a chronic stressor whose energy cost is real and cumulative. The daily rhythm, the container that held everything. The most important single explanation for the 1950s housewives' sustained energy is not any single element of her lifestyle, but the rhythm that organized all of them. The consistent daily rhythm that structured her time from waking to sleeping in a predictable pattern that repeated day after day with the regularity that biological systems require to function optimally. The circadian system, the body's internal timing mechanism, is not merely a sleep-wake clock. It is a master organizer of virtually every physiological process in the body, including hormone secretion, immune function, metabolic regulation, cardiovascular function, and cognitive performance. Each of these systems runs on a circadian schedule that is calibrated by the consistency of the environmental and behavioral cues that the circadian system reads: the timing of light exposure, the timing of meals, the timing of physical activity, the timing of social engagement, and the timing of sleep. When these cues are consistent, when they occur at the same times each day, the circadian system can anticipate them and prepare the body for them optimally. The insulin secretion that processes the morning meal is prepared in advance of the meal's consistent arrival time. The cortisol release that provides morning alertness peaks at the consistent waking time. The melatonin production that prepares the body for sleep begins at the consistent bedtime. The physical processes of digestion, immune response, and cellular repair run on their optimal schedules because the circadian system knows, from consistent experience, when to run them. When the behavioral cues are inconsistent, when meals arrive at varying times, when sleep and waking happen at hours that shift by 1 or 2 hours day to day, when physical activity happens at widely varying times or not at all, the circadian system is deprived of the cues it needs for its optimal calibration. The physiological processes that it should be preparing are not prepared because the system cannot predict when they will be needed. The result is the specific combination of metabolic inefficiency, sleep disruption, immune suppression, and cognitive impairment that chronobiology calls circadian misalignment, and that the contemporary lifestyle produces through the specific patterns of inconsistent timing that characterize it. The 1950s housewife's daily rhythm was consistent not because she was disciplined about biological optimization, but because the structure of her daily life was consistent. The children's school schedule imposed a consistent morning timing. The husband's work schedule imposed a consistent breakfast timing. The household's cooking schedule imposed consistent meal times. The cultural norms of the era imposed a consistent bedtime. And the consistency of all these timing elements produced the circadian alignment that is the biological foundation of sustained daily energy. The week that had a shape. The energy of the 1950s housewife was not only a daily phenomenon, it was organized at the weekly level as well, by a weekly rhythm that distributed the week's work in a way that prevented any single day from being overwhelmed, and that built recovery and maintenance and preparation into the week's structure. Monday's laundry, Tuesday's cleaning, Wednesday's baking, Thursday's shopping, Friday's preparation for the weekend. Each day of the week had its primary task, and the distribution of these tasks across the week's days prevented the accumulation of deferred work that would have required extraordinary effort to address. The specific cleaning task that was done on its assigned day never accumulated to the scale that makes cleaning feel overwhelming. The laundry that was started Monday was done by Tuesday, which meant Wednesday's laundry did not compound Monday's. The weekly rhythm provided a different kind of energy benefit than the daily rhythm: predictability of demand across the week, which allowed the household manager to calibrate her energy investment each day to the day's specific requirements, rather than to the fear of what might need to be done. A woman who knew that Tuesday was the cleaning day and that today was Thursday did not spend Thursday in the background anxiety of wondering when she was going to get the cleaning done. She knew when she was going to get it done, and the knowledge freed her Thursday energy from the carrying cost of that anxiety. Research on planning and anxiety by psychologists studying the relationship between uncertainty and cognitive load consistently finds that the uncertainty of not knowing when a necessary task will be performed imposes a carrying cost on cognitive function that is ongoing and cumulative. The person who knows she will do the cleaning on Tuesday and can set it aside mentally for Monday through Monday night is not paying the carrying cost of the undone cleaning on those days. The person who knows the cleaning needs to be done but does not know when she will do it is paying that carrying cost continuously until the cleaning is done. The weekly rhythm that the 1950s household maintained was therefore not only a practical organization of domestic labor, it was a cognitive organization of the week's demands that reduced the carrying cost of undone tasks by converting them from open loops to scheduled commitments. And the reduction in that carrying cost was itself a source of freed energy. The comparison with today's daily rhythm. The contrast between the daily rhythm that produced the 1950s housewives' sustained energy and the daily rhythm of the contemporary adult is worth stating explicitly, because the contrast is instructive in ways that go beyond the historical comparison. The contemporary adult wakes at a variable time determined by the intersection of last night's bedtime, which was itself determined by the intersection of screen time and the competing demands of the evening, with whatever sleep inertia that incomplete sleep cycle has produced. The morning is reactive, organized not by a prepared structure, but by the competing demands of the day's beginning and the specific depletion of the person trying to meet them on insufficient sleep. Meals happen when they can. Breakfast is often skipped, or is a rapid, low-nutrition event consumed in transit. Lunch is compressed into whatever window the workday allows, eaten at a desk, or quickly in a break room, or, if the schedule is particularly demanding, not eaten at all. Dinner is the meal that the day finally makes room for, often delayed until 7 or 8 in the evening, eaten late in the circadian day when insulin sensitivity is lowest, and when the meal's nutrients are least efficiently processed. Physical activity, if it happens at all, is scheduled into a specific block of time that must be created against the competing claims of the day, and the friction of creating that time is such that the activity either does not happen or happens under the stress of time pressure that reduces its restorative benefit. Rest happens, if it happens, in the fragmented form of scrolling breaks that provide cognitive stimulation rather than cognitive recovery, or in the evening's passive screen time that is not the genuine rest that the body requires for recovery, but that occupies the hours in which genuine rest could have been taken. Social connection happens in the scheduled, effortful form that a busy modern life permits. Dinners planned weeks in advance, social media interactions that simulate connection without providing it, and the specific loneliness of a person who is visible to many people and genuinely known by few. The cumulative effect of this daily rhythm, or lack of rhythm, on the energy available at any given hour of the contemporary adult's day is the chronic, low-grade depletion that contemporary adults have normalized to the point of not recognizing it as depletion. The exhaustion is not an occasional event. It is the baseline condition from which the day is managed, and it is so universal that it seems like a feature of adult life rather than the consequence of a specific, modifiable pattern of daily behavior. What European cultures have preserved. The daily rhythms that sustained the 1950s American housewives' energy were not unique to America, and many of their biological benefits have been better preserved in European cultures that have maintained some of the temporal structures that American culture has largely abandoned. The Mediterranean siesta, the traditional midday rest that continues in various forms in Spain, Italy, Greece, and parts of France, is the preservation of exactly the midday circadian rest that the 1950s Housewives' afternoon pause provided.
The Spanish siesta, which has been studied by chronobiologists as a natural experiment in the effects of midday rest on health outcomes, has been associated in epidemiological research with reduced cardiovascular mortality and sustained afternoon cognitive performance. The French commitment to the regular family meal at consistent times, maintained by the cultural norms around dining that have survived more completely in France than in most other wealthy nations, is the preservation of the consistent meal timing that the 1950s household structure imposed. The French eat at more consistent hours, spend more time at the table, and eat more slowly than Americans, and the combined effect of these practices on blood glucose stability and metabolic health has been the subject of research in nutritional epidemiology that has partially explained what researchers call the French paradox. The German commitment to Feierabend. The German concept of the end of the workday as a genuine and respected boundary between work time and personal time is the preservation of the daily temporal boundary that the 1950s household structure imposed through the natural timing of the husband's return home and the family's dinner hour. The German who leaves work at 5 and does not check work email in the evening is practicing the temporal boundary that protects the recovery hours that the circadian system requires for its nightly restoration of the body and brain's energy resources. These cultural practices, which have survived in various European contexts as deliberate social norms or legal protections, represent the conscious or semi-conscious preservation of the temporal structures that the 1950s American lifestyle maintained by default. The American lifestyle's abandonment of those structures has not been replaced by their deliberate preservation, which is one explanation for why the energy levels of the contemporary American adult are lower than would be predicted from the country's material standard of living. How to recover the lost rhythm. The rhythm that sustained the 1950s housewives' energy is recoverable in principle, if not always in precise form, and the recovery does not require the reconstruction of the 1950s social arrangement that produced it. It requires the application of the same biological principles through the specific forms that the contemporary life makes available. Consistent sleep timing is the first and most impactful recovery. The research consensus on this is clear. Keeping sleep and wake times within 30 minutes of each other 7 days a week, including weekends, stabilizes the circadian system in ways that improve every dimension of daily energy. The smartphone alarm that wakes you at 7 on Monday and the weekend habit of sleeping until 9 disrupt the circadian alignment that the consistent schedule produces. Choosing a consistent wake time and maintaining it through the weekend is the single intervention with the largest return on the circadian system's calibration. Meal timing is the second recovery. Eating breakfast within an hour of waking, eating lunch at a consistent midday time, and eating dinner before 7 in the evening with minimal snacking between meals provides the circadian nutrition cues that the metabolic system requires for its optimal timing. This does not require elaborate meal preparation. It requires the deliberate scheduling of 3 eating events at consistent times, which produces the circadian reinforcement that sustains metabolic function and energy availability. Distributed physical movement is the third recovery. The energy benefit of the 1950s housewives' continuous physical activity throughout the day is not available through household work alone in the modern appliance-equipped home, but it is available through the deliberate introduction of movement breaks into the day's sedentary structure. A 10-minute walk after each meal
standing during phone calls, choosing stairs over elevators, brief movement intervals between periods of desk work. These are not exercise in the formal sense, but they distribute movement across the day in the pattern that produces sustained metabolic energy rather than the concentrated, then absent pattern that a single gym session and 7 hours of sitting provides. The midday rest is the fourth recovery. 15 minutes of genuine stillness away from the screen at the natural circadian low point of the early afternoon provides the restoration that the circadian dip requires. Not sleep necessarily, though sleep if possible.
Simply stillness, cognitive disengagement. The specific rest that is distinguished from scrolling through a feed by the absence of input rather than the presence of passive input. Consistent social contact is the fifth recovery. Not scheduled monthly dinners. Daily contact, however brief, with people who are genuinely known. A neighbor greeted in the morning, a call with a family member in the afternoon, the face-to-face interaction with the colleague or the neighbor or the friend that provides the specific kind of social nourishment that digital contact approximates but does not replace. The energy that was always there. The energy of the 1950s housewife was not a product of her time period. It was a product of her rhythm, and the rhythm was a product of the specific daily structure that her life imposed on her, which aligned with the biological requirements for sustained human energy in ways that most contemporary daily structures do not. The science that explains why her rhythm produced energy has been developed in the decades since her era. The recommendations that emerge from that science describe, in many of their specifics, the life she was already living. Consistent sleep timing, regular meals from real food at consistent hours, daily distributed physical movement, midday rest, genuine social connection woven into the daily routine. She was not following a health protocol. She was living in a rhythm that happened to fulfill the requirements that the protocol later identified, because the structure of her daily life aligned those requirements without requiring deliberate effort to maintain. The requirements have not changed. The circadian system that ran her day runs our day on the same biological principles. The metabolic system that processed her meals processes our meals the same way, responding to the same meal timing and food quality factors that determined her energy levels. The social brain that was nourished by her embedded neighborhood connections is our social brain, requiring the same frequency and quality of genuine human contact for its optimal function. What has changed is the daily structure. The consistency is gone. The timing is gone. The movement is gone. The rest is gone. The embedded social connection is gone. And with them, the energy that they produced is gone too. Not lost permanently, recoverable in the forms that the present makes available, but requiring the deliberate recovery of what the past provided by default, a rhythm, a consistent, biologically aligned daily rhythm that gives the body what it needs to produce the energy that the day requires. She had it without trying because her life imposed it. We need to build it deliberately because our lives do not. The science is on our side. The biology has not changed. The rhythm is waiting to be rebuilt. Please subscribe before you go. We keep finding these forgotten practices and the science that explains them for as long as they are worth finding. And we believe they are worth finding for a very long time yet.